Welcome to the Tactical Cyber Podcast, where we transform strategic cyber insights into actionable tactics for everyday implementation. Join your hosts, retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Darren Mott and Risk Advisory Practice Leader at Warren Averett, Paul Perry. Together, they bring decades of experience from the front lines of cybersecurity and risk management to help business owners and individuals take the actions that will keep their business and personal digital data safe. Each episode, we delve into the world of cybersecurity, sharing real-world experiences, expert interviews, and practical tips to safeguard your digital landscape. It's time to move past cyber strategies and start working cyber tactics.
Hello, friends. Welcome to another edition of the Tactical Cyber Podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Darren Mott. In this episode, we have a special guest. We're going to talk about the Certified Maturity Model the Cyber Maturity Model Certification for the DoD. And so far, this podcast already starting off with a bang, as I can't even announce what we're talking about here. So that's some pretty good time. So before I get in any more trouble, and if you haven't noticed, I'm trying new technology here again. This is an eCam product for the live stream, and I'm sure at some point I will mix it up, and then Paul will laugh at me, and we'll go from there. So, Paul, good afternoon.
Darren, good to see you, man.
I had big plans for that intro, and yet still screwed it up. So,
you know what? It's what the listeners come to expect.
And I did hear it as it was going.
It's part of the vibe.
As the intro is going, I hear I got some message on my computer. I forgot to do not disturb my computer, so I got a ding in the middle of that. So good times already. So, and I did remember to hit record on the podcast stuff. So I'm a little bit ahead of the game right now. So that's good. So. You were in Huntsville yesterday. Talk about what that looked like.
Yeah, I was at a HFMA, Healthcare Financial Management Association. They're one of their regional meetings. I was doing a cybersecurity presentation. Lots of conversation, lots of questions around incident response and just kind of how to be prepared for and what to do when the ransomware notice comes your way, right? So there was a lot of discussion there. But healthcare is one of those places that one of those industries that has a lot of issues in that they have a lot of Internet of Things that are usually tied to a Windows 95 or a Windows 98 or anything old that's not maintained server-wise, right? So a lot of IVs there's a lot of segmentation that goes on in healthcare and hospitals, and so there's always a lot of good conversation there.
So you mentioned incident response. Was it a topic of tabletop exercises brought up?
Tabletop exercise was brought up. It was kind of like, what do we do when we get the notice? How do we handle it? And I back them up and say, well, that shouldn't be the first time you test your policy, right? Your plan. You need to make sure that it's actually can happen. And so you do the tabletop exercise, which we always recommend. But one of the things that I told them, because I've seen this with several other companies, is when they call me and they say, what do we do? I say, well, pull out your incident response plan. They say, well, it's on the computer that has ransomware. So what do I do? And so now my new suggestion is, after the tabletop, get it all nice and neat, print it out, keep it somewhere that you can actually get to it, but then update it. Because I'm afraid what happens is out of sight, out of mind. Somebody wouldn't have updated it for 2 or 3 years. So all that conversation, I think, in the past, we just said, get a plan. And now it's like, okay, now you have a plan, but you got to do something with it.
And I'll be honest, it was a self-serving question because tabletop exercise is one of the services provided by Gold Shield Cyber, which is now 11 days old. That has been since we've last spoken. I quit my other job, started my own job. And so here you go. So what the hell?
I'm glad I could tee that up for you. But I do think, that is a question people ask is, well, how do I do the tabletop? And who needs to be around the table? And is it just read it and make sure it can happen? Or do we need to have absolutely everybody that would be involved at the table? And that's the answer. And you've really got to make it happen all the time. Like you've got to continually test it, especially when you bring new people on.
Well, actually, that might be a good episode for 2 weeks from now because I have access to a platform that does tabletop exercise. I could actually talk to the guy who created it and bring him in and say, hey, come talk about what your thing does.
Sounds like a great topic.
Be a good thing. Okay. All right. So there you go. So already benefit to this podcast, at least for me. I don't know about the rest of you, but here we are. All right. Let's get into some news articles or items. So my news, well, let's go to yours. Yours popped up first. So this is from Microsoft. No, I'm sorry. I got to bring your picture in here. I didn't fix that.
It's from MSN, but it's from something called the Hardy Soul. And look, I'm not trying to get into conversations and conspiracy theories and anything else. I'm pulling this for a reason, right? There's a whole doomsday clock that they move as scientists determine how close we are to the end of the world. And it usually deals with nuclear potential nuclear war, things like that. But what I thought was interesting in this one is they moved it again. But when they moved it, part of the reasoning was emerging technologies and what they call information warfare. And so if you go through the article, there's a whole part that talks about the rise of artificial intelligence and how it's unprecedented in our time and in times past, right? And so it talks a lot about AI fueling misinformation and disinformation. And we've had that discussion on several of these podcasts before, where it's like there are organizations out there just putting negative, incorrect information out there so that when you are pulling from the entirety of the webs, as we sometimes call it, you will get some misinformation or disinformation, right? And that's fueling some of the dysfunction around what's going on. So the technological threat of AI, it plays a big part in a lot of what we do. And we always say during presentations that when technology is created, the bad guys are using it, figuring out a way to use it nefariously very quick, and they're usually faster than those trying to use it for good. But here it talks about the corruption of the information ecosystem, right? So again, not talking more about the doomsday clock, much more talking about the fact that there are lots of people, even scientists, talking about how AI is fueling just this misinformation, disinformation within the information ecosystem. I thought it was quite interesting because it somewhat sums up a lot of what we talk about.
Yep. And I will post a link to this in the show notes if you're listening on the podcast. If while we're talking, when we bring in our guest and he's kind of talking, I'll post the links in the chat if anybody wants to see that. They can see that. And as if you have a comment or a question and you're on the live stream right now while we're doing this, feel free to hit that in LinkedIn or YouTube, wherever you are, and we can bring those in. I'm sure the dozens of people that might pop in, maybe one of them has a question. Who knows? It's hard to say. So my news always has to do with data breaches, it seems like most of the time. So if you ever shipped through a company called, what was it called? Hip Shipper. So if you are a Hip Shipper user, or all the information you've put in that had you shipped something to somebody got compromised. 14 million shipping records accidentally leaked. So I'm sure it wasn't, an accident. Basically human error again, as we talk about cyber issues all the time. Usually it's human error. In this case, this shipper, which is used by people who are on eBay, Shopify, Amazon sellers, exposed millions of shipping labels, revealing customer data. So again, loss of PII, big problem. And now the other issue was, it occurred in December, the peak month for international shipping, because something big happens in December, I believe. And then they didn't really announce it until just now. So bad guys have had access to this information. There's actually a picture of what one of these labels look like. Now, I mean, was there other personal information like your date of birth, stuff like that? No, it doesn't appear that's the case. It appears just the full name, home address, phone numbers, order details. But that goes to help bad guys continue to build updated dossiers on potential targets, because now they know if you've moved in the last year since the last data breach where your information was lost, they now know where you live for real. So, and the other point I make here is if they had 14 million shipping labels, that means they were a fairly robust company, probably with some pretty good revenue, that should have been able to do the basic cyber stuff. But they didn't. They left this stuff exposed. Now, they will say it has been fixed and so on and so forth, but yeah, okay. So, yeah, so good times.
So back up at the beginning of that, up above the label, it talked about there was an unprotected AWS bucket, which I think is an interesting conversation. When we were doing the fireside chat with the AICPA last week, somebody asked the question, if I'm in the cloud, am I more secure than if I'm not in the cloud, right?
Yep.
And part of that goes to, yes, you can use AWS. Yes, you can use those cloud servers, but if you don't understand what you're signing up for, or vice versa, what you're not signing up for. John Q. Public says, I'm using AWS's platform, I should be using their security. Well, if you haven't clicked the box and then you're not getting it, then you're not getting it, and therefore it's unprotected. So I bet what we see a lot of times with cloud is that, I thought I was using their security when I truly wasn't. I had to bring my own. Yeah. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, the worst thing you can think is, well, if I just use a cloud, all my risk goes with the cloud provider. I'm good to go. Your risk is still your risk. Doesn't matter who you give it to. Ask the people who use Snowflake if they felt that they had alleviated their risk by using that platform. I'm going to guess the answer is no, but I digress.
You have your hashtags. I have mine. You can outsource responsibilities. You cannot outsource responsibility. You can outsource process. You cannot not outsource responsibility or accountability for those you use.
Very good. Well said. All right. So with that, let's bring on our guest. He is a certified CMMC professional. His name is Evan Dumouchel of North Star Strategies. Evan, thanks for taking the time to spend with little o' us here on the Tactical Cyber Podcast.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having me.
And we were supposed to have you a couple of weeks, but it was in the middle of the fires in LA. So how are you doing? Is everything good now for you?
Yeah, all's well with me personally. I mean, I think it's been really damaging to the region and some of my friends. But yeah, for me and mine, we're all okay, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yep. So tell us how you got to, obviously, you know, everybody in this world seems like they didn't start off to get to where they are now, right? So how did you get from point A to North Star Strategies? What was point A, and and I'm sure there was a B, C, D, and then North Star ultimately, but give us your history.
You know, I was thinking about this a lot recently. I think I posted something about it on LinkedIn. I think it's all just in response to like fear, right? So we all have these fear-based responses to various things in our life and what we do about them. And so I happen to have learned over time that leaning into my fears is better than leaning away from them. And that was a hard lesson, probably learned from my dad, who served in the military for 25 years. But my background started in network engineering. So my primary first focus in IT was getting my CCNA because I was sitting on a help desk perched on the side of this guy, Randall Kender, trying to soak up all the knowledge I possibly could from him. And he was sort of like a prickly fellow. And so he taught me pretty quickly that you have to understand to take the good with the bad. And so he pointed me towards network. I focused on network for quite a few years, moved over to another small MSP, and then really focused on how the business operations function there. So we were 12 and 20 people, depending on the time of year, depending on the year. And I was the help desk manager, the network engineer, the cybersecurity engineer, the sales engineer, and then ultimately the general manager. And we did a pretty good job with that company, 318, and we were acquired by another MSP, a private equity-backed MSP. And I got lucky in that organization to become the VP of operations. They took a look at 318 and they said, oh, hey, your stuff is really well organized over there. And would you be willing to organize our stuff over here? And I said, okay, why not? And so that was my first experience managing a large group of people. So 70 plus people, with integrating multiple acquisitions and understanding how to get large scale change to happen across a wide population, at least from my perspective. It's really the SMB space, but it was significantly larger than I had managed before. And so that took me to North Star Strategies. I had a deep love of cybersecurity and people, and I saw a lot of issues with adoption and operation problems. So then I decided to focus on how can I integrate operations, cybersecurity adoption, and then my niche is CMMC, because back to fear, when I first heard about CMMC when I was at the MSP, I thought I knew everything. I thought I heard all the questions that I could hear, and I had never heard that in 2017. And so I had to go learn up on it, and then I saw it gaining traction and gaining momentum. And when it reached critical mass, at least for me, that's when I decided to pursue certification and really pursue it with North Star Strategies. So it's a relatively lengthy answer, but that's the background.
That's good. I mean, it's always interesting to hear how people got from point A to point C. Let's talk about what CMMC is, right? If you are in the DIB space, you're well aware of it, but what it does could be valuable for people outside the DIB space, at least the methodology. So just kind of give a 15,000 foot view of what CMMC is, why it's important, why the DoD decided to go that route. And then we'll kind of branch off from there.
It's the cybersecurity maturity model. That's what it's called. And then the C is certification. And I totally agree. I happen to be certified in that space, but what it's really doing is protecting controlled, unclassified information, or federal contract information if you're talking about level 1. So it's a really big deal. It's not classified. It's not top secret, but you definitely don't want to share it with bad actors. And you could say that about PII. You could say that about financial data. You could apply the underlying framework of NIST 800-171 to many different scenarios. You asked about the history. I'll give you a brief history. Initially, one of the pieces of fallout from 9/11 was a really major problem with information sharing. And I couldn't possibly speak to all of the other items, but information sharing is what's related to CMMC. And so interagency information sharing became an issue. And the need for controlled unclassified information arose. And then Obama came out with an executive order, I think it's 13556, but the numbers are really irrelevant to this conversation, that said, here's the concept of controlled unclassified information, this thing that we want to be interagency shared that we deem a big deal. After that, there was this scenario. Paul, you probably know more about it than I do, but there was this fighter jet that China produced that looked a hell of a lot like a fighter jet that the US had designs for that hadn't come out yet. And so they realized that applying some kind of framework was incredibly important to have everybody in the DIB align around something. So it starts with, okay, in the FAR, it's like, please, please, please do cybersecurity and do these 15 controls that we found in this framework that we're not naming yet. Just do these 15 controls. And everybody said, you got it, no problem. And they said they did. And then years passed by. And turns out, shocker, they didn't do any of them. And so then over time, when we get into DFARS clauses 70, 19, 20, and 21, really you can just think about the screws turning tighter and tighter and tighter. So first it's follow NIST 800-171 and do these 15 controls in NIST 800-171, 17 in CMMC. But you've got do these things and then say you did it. Okay, great. Yeah, we did it. Just kidding. Now the government's going to come in and check to make sure you did it. And now finally we get to the differentiation. And I know you've got a graphic you want to share. Mm-hmm. Initially, there were 5 levels of CMMC. Oops. Then now there are 3 levels of CMMC.
Right. So there,
yada, yada, yada.
Right there. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. So if you are working in the DIB, or if you are just in any environment in which you want to apply certain levels of cybersecurity, it's helpful to look at it from this angle. On level 1, you've got 15 requirements. I think officially in the CMMC documentation, you'll see 17, but that's only because the 15th was broken into 2 different requirements. But ultimately, what you're talking about there is a self-attestation in the SPURS system, but you really need to get behind it. Like you actually need to operate at that level because you will have to sign in the SPURS system as the CEO or the CFO or the owner or some high-level stakeholder personal liability that your organization is doing what they say and saying what they do. That's going to be an annual process for you. When you hit level 2, you're now really just aligning exactly to NIST SP 800-171 revision 2. And you have to get, as it says over here, a C3PAO assessment every 3 years. And actually, if I understand it correctly, it's a self-assessment still every year. You're still attesting to that self-assessment annually, and the C3PAO triennially. And then level 3, I think, does not come up nearly as often, but as it's stated here, you've got significantly more controls and you have to get a DIBCAC assessment. So a C3PAO is not going to give you your level 3. But remember that this whole process is iterative. So you need to get level 1 anyway. And then once you've attested to level 1, you're looking at level 2 when you bring in an outside party. And then from level 2, once you've gotten your level 2, you can go for level 3.
And a lot of this, Evan, is based on the type of information organizations have, right? Or the organization they are working with, right? So there may be a contract between this piece of the government and you, and they may say, look, we realize level 1 may be enough, but that's not enough for us. We want you to be level 2. So the different levels is dependent on the kind of information you do have access to, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. So anybody working in the DIB is going to be managing what's called FCI, or Federal Contract Information. As a result of that, anybody, all of them, all of us, need to get level 1, period. And so that means you have to maintain a base level of cybersecurity to deal with FCI. Then the next level up you've described is handling CUI. And there is CUI for level 1 and CUI for level 2. But in most cases, if we're dealing with CUI, it's almost certainly going to be defined in the level 2 space. Correct. And I think what a lot of people are starting to see is an element you alluded to. If you're a prime contractor and you have a host of subs that you like to work with, and you have been for years, and you are going for whatever contracts you need to get, oftentimes that's going to come with a higher level of security because that's going to be tied to a higher level of revenue, oftentimes. And so those primes will very likely pass along the strong ask/requirement to subs to get themselves to level 2. I will say from a advice perspective, it's, as I said a minute ago, it's iterative. So if you don't want to have to boil the ocean, focus on level 1, knowing you're going to have to get to level 2. If you go through the assessment guide, there's a 1 or a 2 next to the control. So it's not a guess. Like there's level 1 controls and level 2 controls. And so you can look at the level 1s and approach them systematically. And if a level 2 is like really low hanging fruit, grab at it, do it. But that's a helpful way to get there.
And in that, talking about the prime contractor and the subs, vendor management becomes extremely important. It's a soapbox I've always had, but it's one aspect of cybersecurity which has nothing to do with technology, but it has everything to do with the protection of the information. And we talked about that earlier when you're using the cloud, but that becomes extremely important for organizations. And I would argue it's one of the biggest, if not one of the top 5 issues we see in organizations is they don't do it. A, they don't understand it. B, they don't have the resources to do it. Or C, it's just too time consuming because I have 20 vendors or subcontractors I have to do it on. So that's probably one of those things that doesn't matter what level you're on, you always need to do good vendor management policies.
It doesn't even really matter if you're going for CMMC or not at this point. So before y'all brought me in, I think you were talking about cloud service providers in general and the sense that you can pass along your liability to them. And you all indicated that's untrue. You got me thinking about a couple of things as you were talking. I'm going to try to remember what all of them were. So from an external vendor management point of view, you want to understand your data flow. One wants to understand their data flow. One of the first parts of a CMMC engagement is going to be talking through a data flow diagram and subsequently a network diagram. And you want to understand your data flow because you want to keep your data flow simple. You might have a complicated environment where you've turned on a bazillion integrations with your personal account and it's going every which way from Sunday. Just know the answer. That's another thing I think about cybersecurity. I kind of don't want to know the answer because then they have to deal with it. But if you know the answer, then you take it down in your POAM one by one. So if you do an effective data flow diagram, you can really reduce all the touch points where the data will go. Keep it as simple as possible. And then you find your way to external vendor management. And that's when you don't have as much to have to do when you have fewer external vendors. And then you got me thinking about customer responsibility matrices or shared responsibility matrices. And I just did a video on this the other day. Fancy spreadsheet. It says, here's the framework that we're following. Here's what we do. Here's what you do. Here's a shared responsibility. Here's something we need to talk about. It just sets the stage for understanding how that's going to operate. And I think it's boring, but it's really important to understand where you hold liability and where you don't.
And it's the communication piece. And Darren, you and I talk about this all the time. You've got to communicate with those you are working with or that are working with your data so that you understand it. You cannot just set it and forget it.
Yeah, totally.
So,
one thing, Darren, you said real quick. You were talking about incident response. A big piece of CMMC and any cybersecurity framework is just reviewing them on a cadence. Most/all ticketing systems worth their salt will have a recurring possibility where you just create a recurring policy, procedure, access review on whatever basis is right for your company. And then ideally you do that. And so if you go through that process, you don't have to, wring your hands about it all the time. You've got it set into your cybersecurity program when you're going to revisit those things. Sorry, Darren, I interrupted.
No, you're good. No, I had a couple questions I think about, because this has been the idea of CMMC has been around for 7 years now. Was it 2018, 2019 where it really started to pick up, and the version 1 was in 2020, and it's just now starting to roll out into some contracting pieces. So with the new administration coming in, has there been any talk about what CMMC will look like now that now it started under Trump 1, right? And then it went through Biden. Now Trump. So is there any, I'm not looking at this from a political perspective. I'm just looking at this from a tactical perspective. What's the future look? I mean, I assume it's just going to continue straight ahead, but you never know because a lot of things are changing. So what's the word on the CMMC street as far as the future of CMMC? And this is an important question for you because you went through all the stuff to get certified for it. So I'm sure you want it to continue.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's confirmation bias from people in the CMMC community that it's full steam ahead.
Right.
But what I will say is this. Because I've been trying to figure out the answer to that too. And when the new administration has been going through looking for budgetary cuts and various other things to pause in order to pursue other directions, from what I understand, any rules that have been finalized continue to move forward.
Okay.
And the rule was finalized before the new administration stepped in. So as a result, literally by a matter of a month or so, from what I understand, it continues on as planned.
That's good. Paul?
And the reason it has been around for 7 years, and it did just become a final rule. And the reason was just kind of the unknown of how is everybody going to take this on, right? There was this whole conversation of how many people need to be assessed and how many true assessors do we have, right? And the C3PAO piece of it was we all could pick up a framework and review the documentation and the processes and the practices and say yes or no. Mm-hmm. The government said, although everything's industry agnostic, we're the government and we want there to be people who are trained to look at it from this perspective, right? And so all of that took so long. And I know there were lots of people trying to help get it going. And it went from, 5 levels to me was like, I could not distinguish between 1 and 2 and 4 and 5. It's like it didn't really make sense. And so I'm glad they finally did get down to 3 levels. But the whole assessor process, I mean, you had to go through a training and a certification yourself to say, I'm certified to be able to give this assessment. Correct, Evan?
That's right. And just to be clear, I am not an assessor yet. What I am is a CCP. So there's registered practitioner. That's level 1. There's CCP. That's where I sit. And then there is a CMMC certified assessor. And beyond that, there's a lead assessor. So what the level that I sit at is I can be on either team, basically. I currently, with Northstar Strategies, I consult with the organization seeking assessment, and I get them ready for the process of being assessed. And I have relationships with CCAs and C3PAOs, et cetera, in order to facilitate that engagement. One needs to be a CCP in order to even try to be a CCA. And to your point in the beginning, I always intended of being a CCP and staying a CCP because I really enjoy the consultative portion of what I do. But I can tell you that the CCAs who taught the courses that I was pursuing to be a CCP were like, you need to become a CCA. Not because I'm so special, but because we all collectively need more CCAs in order to continue to work through the backlog of DIB companies who need to be assessed.
Now, do you find that when you're doing the assessment piece, are companies coming to you, do they realize if we get an assessment first, if we have someone come and assess us, we can figure out where our gaps are so that before we pay for, because we haven't talked about the cost, right? There's a cost to be certified. You don't want to just say, hey, come certify us, and then you pay for it and then you don't pass it, because chances are pretty good. And I'd be interested to hear anecdotes when you go in and do that initial assessment, or someone does that initial assessment. Where are the companies coming down from a percentage of past controls? In other words, are they like 50% or better good, or are they 50% or better or less? Are they not even close to it, like save your money and maybe get certified next year because you ain't anywhere close?
Well,
They don't have multi-factor authentication.
Yeah, right.
That's a really helpful segue to talk through what a major piece of the training for a CCP is. I'm not going to belabor the point, but it's important. Maybe I will belabor the point. We'll see.
Belabor away.
Belabor away. I recommend that anybody listening to this go read the PDF or have your e-reader read it to you. The CMMC assessment process. It's a CAP document, CAP. I was trained on 5.6.1. I think they've got a new version out now. But it goes in phases. And the first phase is working with somebody like me or an internal resource. I'm not here to like hawk my wares too hard, just a little bit. But if you hire someone internally who you think can handle this and is focused on it, getting prepared for your assessment is a huge piece of it. Why do I say that? Because as a part of the assessment, as in what the C3PAO must follow, because it is their documentation they're required to pursue, in the very beginning, they need to collect from you all evidence, all artifacts, all procedures, all policies, all demonstrations of mechanisms to say that you are ready to, as far as you're concerned, pass the assessment. So you need to, I mean, one would think you study for the test before you take the test. But on the other hand, if you're in a pinch and you want to go get it done and you think, yeah, we're pretty good, you will fail. You will fail, even if you are pretty good. But you'll fail because you don't have a system security plan, a data flow diagram, and all of the policies and procedures and mechanisms and artifacts together in that system security plan. Just anybody who's relatively new to this space, a system security plan is a stack of all your junk. And ideally it's organized in a way that somebody can read through it. But sorry, go ahead, Paul, you had a thought.
No, I was just going to say, and it's the one thing when we are talking to organizations, it's the one thing that's like, yes, I understand I need to get that done, but I have limited resources and I just can't sit down and write words. And that's where a lot of organizations will get themselves in trouble. And I've said this on other shows. In any control environment, what is written, what is said, and what is done are three different things. And you have to kind of mirror those, right? And the writing is the piece that it may be low risk that I don't have it, but it's high risk that you don't have it written down because you don't have a plan to follow, right?
Yes.
And it's the most resource intensive thing that I do not get a lot of bang for my buck is what people think and consider, right? So when you're talking to them, it's the hardest piece to get done.
Yeah, it's the hardest thing to get done. And quite frankly, it's the place where you have the most control. So if you can flip your mind to understand that it's actually where you can win, it can be a game changer for how people approach it. CMMC, HIPAA, FINRA, most SOC 2, most of them say what you do and then do what you say, or do what you say and say what you do. Write a policy or write a procedure and then prove to me that you're doing what the policy or the procedure says. That's it. I mean, there are some baseline security requirements that are going to be enforced, like encryption. I mean, there's a lot. I'm not going to go through all of them. There's some like relatively low-hanging fruit about role-based access controls, encryption, etc. But a lot of the other stuff is open to interpretation. They don't say you have to look at your logs daily or weekly. I think they say you must look at them at least quarterly. But there's a lot in between there, you know? So it's like, back to policies, that's where the organization has power, because you keep a straightforward, simple policy and only complicate it if you have to based on need. Back to the CMMC assessment process. So you hand over all your stuff to the C3PAO, which means you've worked with someone like me or an internal resource to get to the place where you feel ready to rock. Then they go through and look at the evidence before the assessment, before it happens, to make sure that you have some artifact that ties to the control or the objective. If y'all aren't aware, listening, every control has between 3 to 5 objectives. And the objectives are your friend. The objectives will say, identify. That means write a policy. Define, that means write a policy. Do, that means create a mechanism or tell them what you're doing to mitigate that issue. So if you look at the verbs in the objectives, it tells you what you're supposed to do or present in order to succeed at the control that sits above them. So that's my humble request, that if you have to pursue CMMC or something else, give yourself the opportunity to read the framework so that you can feel a little bit more capable when you approach it. Skipping to the end of that assessment process, just to be clear, the C3PAO is obligated to tell you to skip it or reschedule it or schedule it based upon what they see in that initial documentation handoff. So all of which is to say, you need to take your assessment with your own family and your own group before you even try to get it elsewhere. That's it.
And what does passing look like? Like if I'm a company, I know I need to pass. What does that mean? Do I have to pass every control, or is there a scale that says, well, it's, do these, you got to pass these 70, these 20, you got to mostly pass, and these 5, if you get a poem, you're good. Although I know poems, you can't do poems anymore, so those are out of the window. But
you can do poems.
Okay.
You can. So in level 2, you have to pass 88 controls, which turns into 80% of your controls.
Any 88 or a specific 88?
Very specific 88.
Okay, gotcha. All right.
A very specific 88. I would be lying if I told you I could tell you every single one of them here, but I can tell you what you look for. Anything that is a 5. So you're scored up to 110 points.
Okay.
320, 110 controls and 320 points, I believe. And any 5s you need to definitely have handled when you go through the assessment. Anything below a 5, as in the score, you are allowed to put on a poem. Additionally, going through the assessment process, there's a certain number of days in which they can tell you on a progress report, hey, this one's not looking good, but I think you can do this to get there. Now, it's a fine line. I've spoken to some CCAs, some of whom are willing to say, I will help you get there once we're in the process of assessment. Others who are going to say, you won't pass this one. And you have until the end of the assessment to ask them to revisit it. And then I believe 10 more days to say, just give me a minute. I'm going to go handle those. And it's a requirement in the assessment process to have a daily check-in with stakeholders from the C3PAO and the client side, and say every single day an update on how they're looking. So you do have time to navigate within the context of the assessment. Now, let's say you get to the end of this and you don't have any 5s. You don't have any 5s that you didn't pass, but you definitely have had to create a poem. At that point, you get a provisional CMMC level 2 that indicates that you are not there yet, and you have to come back with a maximum of 180 days with a poem to close out that poem in the assessment process. Just to be clear, it does not have to be with the same C3PAO who you engaged with initially.
Okay.
It might be helpful to do so, but it doesn't have to be.
Explain what a poem is for those who may not know. Although I assume if you've gotten this far in this podcast, you know what a poem is. Might as well define it.
Plan of action and milestones.
All right.
And that was part of the issue with why it took so long to get CMMC to where it is today. And the final rule is at the beginning, I think you were correct there, and poems weren't talked about and they weren't allowed. But it's like you cannot expect everybody to be 100% perfect all the time. And so they had to add those things back in. And that's really why if you read CMMC 2 years ago, it's completely different today.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What's the cost? What do companies look at? Let's start from point A. I need to bring in my friend or someone to consult and look through this, and then do my initial assessment, fix my problems, and then bring in my C3PO who's going to do my certification. Because this is the problem, right? This is where the complaints are, rightfully so. If you're a 5-person company, can you afford? Mm-hmm. You can't afford not to do it, but can you afford to do it?
I think you can.
Okay.
For a couple of reasons. if you work with someone fractional like me, you're going to be spending less than an internal resource. And so when I'm selling these services to somebody, I will put on my sales hat for a minute because I feel strongly about the way. If you're going to hire someone internally, you're going to pay them 6 figures or more because that's the level of skill set that they need to have. Take that 6 figures and add 33% for the fringe load and burden. You need to pay for their sick time. You need to pay for their paid holidays. You need to pay for their training. You need to pay for the training of the next person once they get fired or they choose to move on. Their documentation internally may or may not be wonderful, and they may or may not hand that off to someone when they choose to move on. So I always tell people think about 33% on top of that salary. So now for the ease, you're at $133K for that person, for the person who you hire for the year to do that. So you should assume to spend approximately 6 figures on your preparation process, or in the high 2 figures if you're working with a fractional, like somebody like me. When you find your way to that, you're going for anywhere between 4 months to a year to get yourself prepared, depending on whether you're looking for CMMC level 1 or level 2. If you achieve CMMC level 1 and you're really close to level 2, I do recommend that you reach out to a C3PAO to schedule several months in advance. If you're on a cybersecurity track, you're building a program and you're confident that you can get there and you have a plan, then you want to engage so that you can get on their calendar because there are not that many of them. When you think about the additional costs that one would need to consider, I think it's important to think about the products and the tools that you will need to use in order to achieve the goals set out. That brings me back to thinking about the data flow diagram and the most important piece of any kind of engagement, which is scoping. So if you can draw the smallest circle that you possibly can around the assets, and the assets can be people, pieces of paper, computers, offices. An asset is a widget. It's anything that goes on the list of things that might be involved in storing, processing, or transmitting CUI. And so when you think about that, you need to start thinking about how you're going to pay for the services like the XDR, the security incident and event management system, things of that nature. And that's a whole different piece of licensing that's usually going to be a monthly ongoing fee. And you do not have to pursue GCC High. I know a lot of people listening to this might be Microsoft people. Now, when I say you don't have to pursue GCC High, I don't say that you can store your CUI in commercial Microsoft 365. But I'm suggesting that there are alternatives to the way that you can choose to flow your data that does not force you to switch your organization to a multi-enclave system or pay for GCC High for everybody. There's a lot of options. And so talking through what those might be is of great benefit before you start plunking down money. I think a lot of people spend a lot of money on CMMC and other cybersecurity prep through false starts and going down the wrong road and getting stuck in subscriptions that they don't really need. Something that I really value is looking through a client's IT stack and determining what is not being utilized in the tool stack that they already have. Can you achieve this goal with the tool stack that you've already got? A lot of these tools, like a threat locker or something like that, they have a ton of features. In fact, they have so many features that the person managing it probably doesn't know most of the features. And as a result, they're not using them. They look to stack something else on to cover that. When you look at paying for the actual assessment, I think you find yourself looking at a whole range of pricing. But I think you should be planning on, at minimum, $25,000 to $30,000 to get the assessment done. And so that varies. I don't run assessments. I'm not going to give you a price tag on that. But I have seen them running like that figure or upwards. And when you work with somebody like me, you engage in a long-term relationship. You can call it a project if you want to. If you put it on your line items, you can say, this is our project. But from my perspective, it's a recurring revenue for me, recurring cost for them. And ultimately, if you look back to the beginning of what I was talking about, significantly less than having to hire somebody internally. Just like, I'm not even selling anything there. It's just like put it on a spreadsheet and figure it out. It's going to be less than hiring somebody internally.
All right. As I like to say, we're here for a good time, not a long time. So, Paul, last question to you.
Yeah, Evan. I mean, I would say that the biggest thing people think about from a client compliance perspective is I've checked the box, now I'm secure. And I would argue that that is one of the things that we have to change the mindset of, right? The compliance is important, it's good, but you've got to do things not just to check the box, but to be secure. And that's probably a lot of the conversation you're having with folks, and you probably have to battle that. Would you agree that they call and they say, hey, just make sure that I can check all 15 of these boxes? Okay, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. We need to do it for the right reasons. And so your thoughts about compliance versus security and how you continue to beat that drum even in the face of something like a CMMC.
Yeah, security is the primary focus that hopefully will lead to compliance. I don't like to work in the other direction. And I think CMMC instills that. I don't think a lot of people are going to pass a CMMC level 2 if they're focusing on compliance and not cybersecurity. Maybe there's going to be a couple who squeak through, but you have to go through the assessment and answer the questions. And the way in which that information is evaluated is examining, interviewing, or testing the information. Interview is a big deal. That means that they can ask anybody in your organization, hey, how's this thing work? And they have to be able to answer it, provided they fall within the scope of being expected to within their job distinctions, right? And so I think that when you look at cybersecurity and you work backwards from the perspective of an auditor, examine, interview, test. All right, so we have to be able to test these mechanisms and make sure they work. So that means that from a cybersecurity perspective, you need to have something in place, whether it's a procedure or a tool that will do that. Interview means you have to train all the relevant people at your organization in the fact that cybersecurity is a part of your culture, and it's part of what the lifeblood is of your organization to continue making trust and integrity with your clients. I'm not saying anything new here, but if you work backwards from, I've said it a few times, the objectives in the framework or what the auditor is going to be asking for when they go through your materials, it actually just indicates to you where you can focus as an operator or a business leader to achieve those objectives internally at your organization. And I guess a plug for something that is really important to me, I mentioned to y'all that I've worked in operations for many years with a large organization. And so when I think about that, I really think about what it takes to gain adoption of anything, in this case, cybersecurity, across a large audience. And I always try to focus on objectives and key results. I think if you've been on any kind of leadership team, you'll talk about rocks. Rocks has always felt a little bit squishy to me, even though rocks are hard, but you get the idea. It's like rocks are rarely achieved, but objectives and key results work very similarly to controls and objectives in a framework. So big picture goal for the organization, what are the key results we're going to do to get there, and then what are the tasks that each department is going to do to get there. And you talk about that on all of your all hands meetings when you allow for the cybersecurity team or the CTO or whomever to have a seat at the table and present. And you're talking about that with the whole org and why it's important. And you're engaging different parts of the organization. So Pam from HR is going to talk about what they're doing to achieve this goal. And Robbie from operations is going to talk about what they're doing to achieve this goal. And if people at that company don't care about that, then they'll find their way out of the organization. And it doesn't mean you have to fire them or do anything like that. They'll just get sick of you talking about the stuff that's important to the organization, and they'll choose to go somewhere else. And I think that's the best way to build a culture around what's important to you. Just live it and make it right in front of people's faces. And if they don't like the show they're watching, they'll change the channel.
All right, Evan, how do people find you? I put your email there on the screen, and I'll put it in the show notes. But how do people find you? Find you on LinkedIn, all the things. Do the things.
All the things. So you can find me at northstarstrategies.work or northstarstrategies.us. My email is evan.dumouchel@northstarstrategies.work, and you can find me on LinkedIn at LinkedIn/whatever it says /Evan Dumouchel at my profile.
Yeah, and you're on a lot of podcasts. I see. I've seen a lot of your links for podcasts, so that's good that you're getting the CMMC word out. Because the one thing we didn't get a chance to talk about is the framework works for entities beyond beyond, like you mentioned at the beginning, beyond the defense industrial base. I mean, just because you don't have a CUI doesn't mean you don't want to protect your stuff. So it's a good place to start at least. And I'm gonna ask more questions. Sorry. So if a company doesn't need to do CMMC, but they want to do compliance, do you still do that? We just do that.
100%.
All right.
I've got clients working on HIPAA, SOC 2. I told you there's a FINRA client that's focusing on that right now. I will help any client on their framework and their goals and their policies and procedures and their cybersecurity culture. I'm very passionate about it.
Good. All right. And for those that come
Thanks for fighting the good fight.
Yes, thank you, Evan. And for those that come to Gold Shield Cyber for compliance, I'm going to redirect them to North Star Strategy because I'm not doing any of that stuff.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming on, Evan. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Evan.
All right, Paul. What do you got for this weekend? I know you're probably not playing pickleball because you're afraid.
No, you keep saying no.
No,
I don't think I have anything this weekend. I was talking to another organization today, and I'm putting together a 4-hour cyber presentation. And I'm going to focus a lot on governance, right? And I'm going to get down into the details of incident response plans and vendor management because I think we have to do those things better. But governance is one of those things that's become a passion. And Evan was talking about it, culture. If you don't have the culture right, nothing else matters. So you've got to start there.
So I hope your first slide says we're here for both a good time and a long time.
Good time and a long time. I will put it just for you. Okay. Just for you, Darren.
That's excellent. I want to see a picture. I want to make sure it's there.
Yeah, it'll be there.
All right, I'm going to.
What about you? What you got going on?
I'm rehabbing my elbow, my torn bicep tendon. So I'm learning to play like a ball left-handed. I suck at it, but whatever. Have I what?
Have you been able to notch it out more?
No, Thursday. I can go 10 degrees.
How much longer?
8.5 more weeks.
Wow.
Yeah. So at least probably 3 more of these podcasts will still have something on here, but I'll be able to move it more the next time. So that's good. All right, Paul. Thanks. We'll talk again soon.
Talk soon. Bye.
All right. And for everybody else, thanks so much for taking the time to listen or watch or download the Tactical Cyber Podcast. You can find it on all your favorite podcast providers, and you can watch the replay on YouTube or LinkedIn if you're so inclined. If you have thoughts or questions, feel free to hit up either Paul or I. You can find us on LinkedIn. If you want to text me, I can not text me. If I message me on LinkedIn, I can send you our contact information if you are so inspired. With that, know that knowledge is protection. If we can understand the threats targeting us, we can assess our risk, proceed wisely. Thanks again for listening or watching. We will see you in a couple weeks with more Tactical Cyber.
To the Tactical Cyber Podcast. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of their respective employers. If you have thoughts, comments, or suggestions on the Tactical Cyber Podcast, email Darren at thecyberguide.com. You can also follow Darren and Paul on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Darren Mott or linkedin.com/in/Paul M. Perry CPA. Paul Perry is a member of Warren Averett CPAs and Advisors, where he leads the firm's risk advisory and assurance services team, a group dedicated to optimizing businesses' financial, operational, and technology controls so that organizations can make strategic choices for sustained growth. Learn more at warrenaverett.com. Stay safe, stay secure, and we'll see you next time.